Welcome back to beautiful Superstition Mountain. So today we're going to have a lesson on geometry. In golf there's a lot of geometry that's going on, and we have to make sure that the geometry that we are using from setup through our golf swing lines up with what we're trying to accomplish. So first off, let's talk about how our setup changes based on the club we're swinging. So first thing, we all know that the shorter the golf club, so swinging a pitching wedge, my goal with how I hit this golf ball is slightly different than what it is the longer the golf club. So if I'm swinging a pitching wedge, I'm going to apply less loft and more downward angle of attack to the golf ball than I would if I was swinging a driver. And let's talk about how the way we set up changes that. Okay, so first thing, no matter what club I swing, I like to make sure that my pelvis, my hips are situated level in between my feet. So I don't want to see your right hip up at address, and I also don't want to see your left hip high at address. I want to see your pelvis centered between your feet. Now what happens with our upper body varies from club to club. So because my goal with the pitching wedge is a more downward angle of attack and lower loft on the golf club, I want less tilt. So with let's just say we're going to start with a wedge. With wedge, I basically want zero tilt. So the ball is going to be, kind of just forward to center in my stance, which puts it kind of on the left side of my face, left ear. And if you draw a line from my buttons on my shirt to my belt, I want that more or less standing straight up and down with a wedge, okay? Now as the club gets longer, what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of right side bend to create some tilt. So if I'm swinging let's move from wedge to middle iron. So now 7-iron. So 7-iron is going to have a couple of degrees of tilt, probably 3 or 4. Okay? Now what that 3 or 4 degrees of tilt will do is it'll allow us to hit down 3 or 4 degrees less on the ball. So instead of with a wedge, generally I'm going to be hitting down anywhere from 8 to 10 degrees ballpark. When I get out to 7-iron, I'm hoping I'm hitting down more like 6 or 7. Okay? And then as we move out to 4-iron, so instead of having the 3 or 4 degrees of tilt, now we're going to have 5 or 6. So we're going to have a little bit more tilt with that 4-iron, a little wider stance, a little bit more tilt, right side bend, allows us to be able to come into the ball on a shallower angle of approach. So now with that 3 or 4 iron on the ground, we're going to be hitting down on that one 3 or 4 degrees. Generally I like the downward angle of attack to more or less match the number on the club. Okay, and that is until we reach driver. So what changes with driver? So we go from 0 tilt with a wedge, and driver we're actually going to have about 10. So the angle is going to be about 10 degrees of tilt. But now instead of having the ball more or less off my left ear, now that ball is going to move forward over to my left shoulder. Okay? Now, by making that adjustment, I got 10 degrees of tilt, the ball's more forward in my stance. Now I'm catching the ball a little bit later in the swing, so instead of hitting down on it some degrees, I'm going to catch it somewhat on the up. That's how you create your angle of approach. Now let's talk about how bent over we are forward. Now for me, with every club, I like to see more or less the same amount of frontward bend. And the amount of frontward bend is the amount that I need to get myself situated with my balance points right. So I want to have kind of the back of my arms and my knees and the balls of my feet all more or less lined up. So if I bend forward this much, you can see that put the back of my arms outside of my toes, and I've got lots of weight on my toes. So we're going to make sure we're set up correctly. There's a little inclination in my hips, but not too much. So your pelvis is going to be slightly inclined, not a ton. So this is called anterior pelvic tilt, and this backwards would be posterior pelvic tilt. We want to make sure that we don't get too much anterior pelvic tilt at address. This is a really common problem I see, is the belt aiming too much down. I'd like to see the belt get a little bit more level to start with, so that as we put it in motion we can maintain it. So now let's talk about what happens when we put this in motion. So I'm going to use a couple of sticks here to help us with a diagram. With a wedge, we want to have more or less no tilt. Driver, we want to have about 10 degrees of tilt. The ball is going to be a lot more forward. So you can see the difference in what that would look like. But in both scenarios, I want my pelvis centered. Okay, now when we put this in motion, both parts of our body need to turn on the plane that they're set up on. So because my belt line has a slight tilt in it, and I have an inclination in my back, these two lines are going to be slightly different because I'm bent over slightly more than my belt line is. So as I turn back, you can see this has risen up and this has come down some degree. And my shoulders have turned on a plane that is steeper than this one. Now it's really important that as we're making our turn, that we allow our body to turn on the natural planes that they're on. So if I turn back and this levels up, that makes it really difficult for me to get my shoulders inclined on the right plane. And vice versa, if I turn back and that turns too much up, you can see what effect that had on my shoulder turn. So it's really important that both pieces do what they're designed to do, okay? And that needs to happen throughout the swing. So we make this nice turn back. You can see my hips are on an incline, my shoulders are on their incline. Now in transition, what I would like to have happen is I don't want the lead side to elevate too soon. I also don't want the rear side to elevate too soon. What I would like to see happen, as we've talked about before, we need a little compression into the ground. You can see when I did that, that actually dropped my lead side, both parts of my lead side. So my hips dropped and my shoulders dropped in transition. So you don't want to see this moving this way. It's more of a compression into the ground. So the feeling of kind of sitting down as you begin to unwind will help that happen. So now we've kind of sat down, our lead side's low. Now we can go ahead and start to turn around. And now once again, we want to have the same relationship. So I want this side to work up, this side to work down on the plane it started on, and my shoulders do the same. If we can do that, our golf swing maintains its symmetry, and quality contact is much easier to make happen.